Being alive is a grinding, soul-crushing experience. We live in a world where we must abide by authority, pay those frivolous taxes, and you better watch out for those nasty thugs. If you're young enough to still be attending school, then you also get the pleasure of not only depositing 8 hours of your weekday locked up in an institution, but equal dissatisfaction in having to carry back even more math homework. You know, I thought the whole point of school was to have a dedicated place for learning, but I guess there isn't enough to cram inside a kid's head. I'm sure Bayes' formula is going to be real useful for all the aspiring medical students out there. Thankfully, we can use all sorts of electronic media to escape the harsh realities of this world. I mean, how else can we find catharsis if not for watching your avatar commit murder in our favour? That's the kind of power fantasy we can all enjoy. Yeah, of course it's okay to burn the living flesh off your opponent because they're the bad guy anyway. Nothing morally wrong here. RPGs are particularly enticing for giving you a range of execution methods to assign to your innocent Neko girl. It gives the player lots of control. It's all just cheap escapism to feed our dopamine receptors. And yet, RPGs weren't always so free in the way they offered player choices. Old school RPGs like Dragon Quest, Wizardry, and Ultima were more defined by their difficulty. You were lucky to have an inventory capacity greater than the double digits. Monsters in the next era would immediately overpower you. And key items were hidden on random overworld tiles unless you remembered the advice some NPC gave you in a town on the other side of the map. Older revisions of Dungeons & Dragons didn't play around when it came to dungeon navigation either. That's right, the forebearer of RPGs itself, the game that defined role-playing still had the courtesy to beat you up. Even a baby game like Mother 1 had dungeons like this, and enemies that hit different. Some of you may be disgusted by the very idea of having to put effort into thinking in a video game, but it turns out, healthy people like exercising their brain. Games have always been a great way to train observation and strategy, so what separates chess from Dragon Quests? What was the appeal of older RPGs? Math homework, stay with me here. The core of RPG gameplay, role-playing game gameplay, revolves around managing numbers. These numbers can indicate endurance, prices, damage, and other statistics. But more importantly, there's also a metaphysical mind game in how to approach each segment. How many steps can I take before triggering an enemy encounter? Is gaining the amount of experience points needed to reach the next level faster than completing the next dungeon? Will the next level up provide my character with enough strength to surpass my opponent's defenses? How many turns will it take to deplete my target's health bar? What is the current position relative to the dungeon's entrance? Should I cast a healing spell at the cost of MP, or use a potion I bought, or do neither and just wait until I get back to town? Which option is the most effective, and what's my current situation are common thought experiments players must consider when presented with any strategic challenge. And that challenge is amplified with the difficulty seen in older RPGs. When enemies and status conditions pose a real threat to your party, sometimes with penalties as drastic as permadeath or halving your total wealth, then that's when every number forms into a puzzle to mentally navigate through like the very dungeons your party has to trudge through, understanding what methods can be applied to the problem and working towards a solution. Algebra is the best Megaten game. Honestly, I could go further with this and imply that every video game, or even a reality in general, can be tied back to your math assignment, but I use RPGs as an example specifically because I think these games offer the most direct comparisons, next to puzzlers, since they revolve more on strategy. So, has society collapsed and now we can't have thought-provoking gameplay in our RPGs anymore? Yes, and it's all because of Final Fantasy. Nearing the end of the 80s, Square released Final Fantasy I to a fantastic success. However, unlike other RPGs at the time, Thinner Fanta is much easier than the former dungeon crawlers. The game started you off with multiple party members with no permadeath. There were no inventory penalties like weight limits or magnetite. Dungeons had shorter branches to explore, usually as short as a single room. Dungeon navigating. The biggest offender was that healing items could stack all the way up to 99. What's even the point of having a gauntlet cade if you can just fully restore your party's health after practically every battle? The only real difficult part of the game was the Astos boss, because it had a chance to instantly wipe out a single party member. I redid this fight 3 times in total, not because I couldn't beat him, but because I wanted my entire squad to get the XP. If Dragon Quest was like solving a satisfying mystery case, then Final Fantasy would be like opening a box. And Mother 1 would be like infiltrating a government security lock. Why is this game so hard? Some could say that the game is easier because it wanted to constitute multiple playstyles depending on the classes you select at the beginning. but other games beforehand also allowed this type of party selection. Though according to an older interview, our lad, Akitoshi Kawazu, stated that they didn't care about game balance, and I think you can take that statement both ways. It's true they definitely didn't test the game with every combination, since thieves don't even work, but it also allows for less punishing customization, since the game is already easy enough to accommodate most party setups. For many RPG fans at the time, Final Fantasy was like an easier digital version of D&D. You could watch each of your warriors grow stronger over time, damage numbers increasing, accessing a large number of spells, and even their physical appearance changing via promotion, providing an easy power fantasy for anyone to experience and experiment with. What I'm trying to get at is, FF1 was always meant to be easy in comparison to other RPGs at the time, but it's left a question for game design critics, which has only become more relevant as games become more like RPGs and RPGs become less challenging. Should power fantasy be easy? We're over 3 decades removed from those crusty dungeon crawlers, and while there are certainly a few difficult RPGs nowadays, veteran gamers can agree that games have generally gotten easier, and yet gaming is more popular today than it ever was before. And as the world continues to be rotten, you'll see more praise for the escapism and power fantasy found in video games. Personally, I prefer my difficult games more, much like with math homework, and I'm certainly not in a position to decide what the best difficulty is for how people gain catharsis when slaying a virtual goblin. Though one thing I can affirm is that some games are intended to be easy. That may be the case for Final Fantasy, but even more so for Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls. 2/3 into the video and I'm finally talking about the Souls game! Dawn of Souls was one of the re-releases for FF1, but unlike the previous revisions, this version was notable for being extremely easy, controversially removing the harder difficulty modes along with ineffective attacks, and replacing the Vancian magic system with the standard MP bar. All the changes listed would have already made the game significantly easier, but this was only the dawn of baby-proofing, because it's clear that FF-DOS was released to reaffirm and double down on the original's lenience. Saving can be done inside dungeons, effectively allowing you to save scum through. I get that this is a handheld game, but these labyrinths weren't ever long to begin with, and the Game Boy Color port of Dragon Quest kept the same saving system regardless of being on the go. Items can still be stacked up to Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and additionally the item prices are not only cheaper, but there's now access to Phoenix Downs. Originally you had to visit a church in town to revive knocked out party members, but now you can do it on the go, Uber Eats, and this item is available as early as the very first town. Keep in mind, even Pokemon games had the courtesy to wait a couple more towns before offering such useful recovery items. This post-apocalyptic 80s RPG remake is somehow even easier than the game made for literal toddlers. Depending on who you ask though, these measures can be considered as good or bad, since the type of difficulty we enjoy is ultimately subjective. Although it's not my jam, I still think it's very cool that there's an RPG a 5-year-old can play, only to be rivaled by Bloodborne. Okay, but really, it's good to have a spectrum of difficulty in each game genre. Final Fantasy set the tone for the rest of the games in the franchise, and Dawn of Souls reiterated the easier design. You can have your sagas and your FFs. One important thing that was added were the new Souls of Chaos dungeons, just in case you needed more powerful equipment and extra levels to grind. The order of floors you access are randomized for each run, containing remixed enemies and backdrops. It's a fun way to re-experience different aspects of the game in 4 condensed locations. It's certainly not difficult, but neither was the rest of the game. The real highlight here though is the fan service. Some of these floor layouts have references to past games, like Altair Cave from Final Fantasy III or Crescent Island from Final Fantasy V. There's also easier versions of bosses found in other Final Fantasy games. Ultros from Final Fantasy VI, the Archfiend bosses from Final Fantasy IV, Gilgamesh. Square never got around to remaking Final Fantasy III on the WonderSwan, so it's cool to see some of those enemies, bosses, and even locations return. Would have been cool if we did get the first 6 Final Fantasy games on GBA, but at least the concept still lives on with the recent pixel remasters. Shinryu from Final Fantasy V is easily the best fight in the game, using stat-boosting items to tank massive hits, while prioritizing who to cure since the group healing spells can't outdo the incoming attacks. It's a great fight that makes the most of the game's limited mechanics, without being too difficult. The Omega fight on the other hand is just as bad as its original. It's very repetitive and it takes ages to defeat, the worst kind of RPG boss, and it's really bizarre since both of these fights are put right next to each other. No idea what happened here. Oh wait, I forgot Final Fantasy II! So FF2 is already infamous for its interesting game mechanics, and the Dawn of Souls version set the mood to super mega doo-doo baby difficulty. I don't actually have anything to add or say about Final Fantasy II's weird flex. All I'll say is that the easier difficulty made grinding skill points easier, so I can fulfill a viable fisticuffs only playthrough. There's also this exclusive laugh sound effect that was added. Excuse me? Souls of Rebirth was a new story segment added to incorporate more symmetry to the narrative. In the main game you descend to hell to beat up Satan, and in the new campaign you yeeted to heaven to chainsaw God. Wait a minute, they also added new dialogue, which is kinda cute. Look, there's almost a story here. I'd be more impressed if I was 5. Yeah, I think that's all covered now. Basically, Dawn of Souls shows that it's okay for a game to pursue a more casual design philosophy, even if it's different from what other games in the same genres were doing at the time. It may not be my math homework, but if you're gonna make an easy game, it's generally better to commit to that difficulty. Gotta own that look. Join me next time where I talk about chunky goblins and why I like them. Goodbye.